Hello, and welcome back to the Okanagan Reader. I'm your host, Jim Bowering. Today's reading is Chapter 9 of Green Comet, the first book in the Green Comet trilogy. In this chapter, we learn why Elgin wanted Minder to look into the tragic affair of Yellow Comet. We also see how Green Comet came to be. Minder does some thinking about how adoration and respect for Elgin has some bad side effects. And he also learns more about what Elgin must have been going through all these years. That should be enough to get you interested. So, time to get on with Chapter 9 of Green Comet. Here we go then. Chapter 9, Yellow Comet. Minder was planning to look up Yellow Comet in the Commons, but first he wanted to check out the relationship between awe and fear, and also between adoration and fear. He wasn't concerned with the children's fear. That was a natural reaction to such an event in their young lives. They were experiencing something new and uncertain, but all they needed was a little reassurance. What did concern him was their guardian's reaction, and that of the Franciscans. A little research gave him a working hypothesis. The fear was probably due to the realization of their vulnerability. Whether they were conscious of it or not, they instinctively knew that the power of their adoration or awe could overwhelm them. They could lose themselves to the object of their feeling. Minder stopped and thought about it. In a few minutes he conceded the logic, and that made him wonder about his own relationship with Elgin. He knew he was in awe of him, and he certainly adored him, but was he afraid of him? He thoroughly explored his feelings and decided not. He was afraid of disappointing him. He was afraid of failing in his responsibility to him. But that was all. He wasn't afraid of Elgin himself, and he wasn't afraid of his feelings toward him. Minder relaxed. A contemplative smile spread over his face. Elgin might be gruff sometimes, even cranky. But Minder knew that was nothing to be afraid of. That was just Elgin dealing with his life. He was a special man who had responded admirably when circumstances required it. He acted heroically and had to endure heroic pain and loss. He deserved his elevated reputation in Green Comet, and he lived up to it as well as any man could. But Minder knew the real Elgin, or at least he was trying to. You could love him and stand in awe of him, but that was because he did those things in spite of being only a man, not because he was unlike everyone else. Minder knew why people put Elgin on a pedestal, but he knew they didn't have to. The Commons had a great deal of material about Yellow Comet. In addition to the straight encyclopedic entries full of dates and facts and numbers, there were in-depth analyses, a great many theories, plenty of rants and screeds, and just as many emotional homages. Minder realized that he had seen most of it already, or at least something like it. It was just the sort of thing one picked up in the normal course of living. The fact that it was common knowledge was why he was surprised when Elgin made such a point of it. But he had. Therefore, Minder would study the material in the Commons until he understood why. He settled on the factual accounts, thinking that it would be best to just get the data and allow his mind to come to its own conclusions. It might be drier than the more colorful and tempting opinion pieces, but it would be worth it in the long run. Yellow Comet was the third in a series of comets that were selected to be inhabited for one or more orbits. The idea of catching and colonizing comets suddenly struck Minder as a brazen one, and he had a renewed admiration for his ancestors. Looked at in the long view, though, it was a natural step for his species, which had such a long and intimate relationship with comets. Especially after their planet was nearly destroyed by one, it was inevitable that the relationship would develop as it had. In preparation for their migration to the comet, 10,000 people marshaled at the launch site. There they would register and prepare for departure, checking through their 100 kilograms each of luggage. Of all the planning they did for the journey, most of them agreed that choosing what would make up that 100 kilos was one of the most difficult parts. What do you take when you might be gone for centuries? All of the passengers were synesthetes, most with strong expressions of the complex. It was the first time that most of them found themselves surrounded by their peers, Being in such a large crowd of people who shared their experiences was a delightful liberation. The air was full of a happy roar of conversation. The place rang with the laughter of people who found that everyone they met understood the predicaments they faced in their lives. Fast friendships were formed in those few days. That was especially obvious in the gangs of children running and laughing everywhere. It was a happy time, and an affirmation of their decision to take this journey. There were a few, though, who had second thoughts. As the time to leave the planet grew suddenly imminent, a few people changed their minds. They realized that they were bound too strongly to some person or place, and they decided to call it off and go home. That turned out to be lucky for them, and unlucky for the eager replacements on the standby waiting list. Everyone was gathered for the final full assembly when it happened. After this, they would break up into groups for assignment to their launch vehicles, and the transfer to orbit would begin. When the men walked onto the stage, the speaker tried to politely usher them back off. She was smiling at them in a friendly way, so it was a shock to everyone when they shot her in the head and her body dropped abruptly to the floor. At the same time, a dozen men around the perimeter of the audience discharged automatic weapons into the air. There were scattered screams, and some of the children were crying, but on the whole there was silence. All eyes turned back to the stage, where one of the men stepped forward to speak. He spoke for several hours, quoting liberally from the scriptures of his theology. To his listeners it was a meandering diatribe, but his meaning soon became clear to them. They were degenerate subhumans, and he wasn't going to allow them to pollute his God's celestial sphere. As it went on and on, they experienced the bizarre sense of growing boredom. Here they were, trapped by armed men, and they found their attention wandering. They began to get restless, shuffling their feet and looking around. Children began to complain that they had to go to the bathroom. Some of them spoke out, trying to point out the impracticality of the situation. Things couldn't go on like this. They shouted at the man that it was impossible. The men nearest the protesters opened fire and shot them, along with anyone unfortunate enough to be standing near them. Some died immediately, and some were only wounded. Anyone who tried to help the wounded was shot. Eventually, realizing that these men intended to kill them all anyway, they hatched a plot to overcome them. The crowd on one side rushed the gunmen, heedless of their casualties, and were able to overpower several of them and take their weapons. Then the men exploded, killing or maiming several hundred more people. Their captors were fitted with explosives. When things settled down after the explosions, people could see that the fallen gunmen had been replaced. Who knew how many more were outside the stadium, waiting to fill in for their fallen comrades? That's when despair set in. It was worst for the children. Looking to their parents and the other adults for guidance or salvation, all they saw was the hollow look of defeat. So in the stench of gunpowder and the shredded bodies of their murdered friends and family, they awaited their fate in docile numbness. While they were torturing their victims, the kidnappers, who called themselves God's Purity Brigade, were making their demands known to the rest of the world. They insisted that governments everywhere forbid their synesthetic citizens from ever going into space. They also wanted them to keep synesthetes out of various specified occupations, and to generally restrict their activities. In addition, they wanted them sterilized as soon as their synesthesia was discovered. But most immediately important, they mustn't be allowed to defile the celestial sphere. Any hope of a reasonable negotiation was dashed by their cruel and callous actions. Over the next few hours, they did nothing to change that impression. All their actions created a picture of fanaticism. As they rejected every attempt at moderation or compromise, people on the outside slowly lost hope for a peaceful resolution to the crisis. Governments representing all the migrants appealed to the government of the country hosting the launch facility. They assured everyone that they were making their best efforts to resolve the situation. They made public displays to that effect, including arresting, imprisoning, and torturing people, but the consensus was that they were stalling. The country had until recently had a democratic government, but a revolution had replaced that with a theocracy. There was a wide-held suspicion that it was sympathetic to the kidnappers, so no one was very optimistic about getting their cooperation. Apparently the terrorists only wanted to make sure they had everyone's attention, because they didn't continue the negotiations very long. By the time the victims' courageous attempt at liberty ended in explosions and bloody mayhem, the man on the stage was just about done talking. He shouted a few more insults, dramatically praised his God, and triggered a portable thermonuclear device. The world was stunned. Naturally, they immediately lost the video feeding the explosion, but other cameras, some belonging to news organizations and private individuals, but others obviously set up in advance by the killers, gave them a good view of the grotesque pillar of smoke and fire. It was obvious that there would be no survivors. 10,000 people were murdered in 1 second. There was something the terrorists and their allies hadn't accounted for, though, and that was the radioactive plume of dust engulfing the capital city a couple of hours downwind from the blast site. Maybe they did factor in the most likely wind direction in their original planning, but when the time came and the wind didn't oblige, they decided to go through with it anyway. There would still have been enough time for government officials to flee, leaving behind a city full of martyrs, but they were trapped by a mob of protesters demanding the release of the hostages. Even their helicopters were no help because somehow or other there were several portable rocket launchers in the crowd. They had to remain in the city to suffer radiation poisoning along with everyone else. The country became a pariah. Scathing criticisms rained down on it from all parts of the world. Even its most loyal allies put distance between them. No one wanted to be associated with such a heinous act. Everyone agreed that they had always known that no good would come of a theocratic revolution, that democracy and freedom were always best. At first, nobody sent any aid or assistance. There was a righteous consensus that they had brought their troubles on themselves by letting such a thing happen in the first place. Thousands more would die for lack of anti-radiation drugs. This phase didn't last long, though. The uprising that began in the capital city swept the country, meeting very little resistance even from the military. Within a few weeks, things were so different there that outsiders began to come in again. That began a long and successful period of liberty and enlightenment in the region. The blast site was isolated and protected as a commemoration to the victims, and the country eventually regained its status as an important gateway to outer space. Minder stopped reading and found that he was breathing fast, shallow breaths. He felt as if he had been struggling with something. This was a stronger reaction than he had ever had before to the story, and he wondered why. Even though he knew the outcome, he'd found himself hoping it wouldn't happen, hoping they'd come to their senses and those people would be saved. Even through the dry prose of historical reporting, he found himself emotionally bound to them. He was glad he chose text with no accompanying video. That would have been too much. This must have to do with Elgin. He was having new feelings about a familiar story because Elgin mentioned it. Naturally, he would invest it with new meaning if it meant something to him. Minder was glad, all things considered. It was a very important story, and he was glad to be able to feel something commensurate with that. But what of Elgin's reason for suggesting it? Could the Franciscans really be as bad as God's Purity Brigade? Surely not. But then Minder remembered the ferocity of at least one of them, the woman. It didn't take much imagination to picture her in the story he'd just read. Mix in a few fellow fanatics and a charismatic leader, and it wasn't out of the question. Even their leader, who appeared to be more reasonable, had brushed him aside with contempt, and he'd called him a name while doing so, replacing his individuality with a derogatory cliché. That was different only in degree from the leader of the killers calling his victims filth. Their excuses were the same. For the Franciscans, none of their saints had forearms. For the GPB, none of their prophets had synesthesia, a good enough excuse for rudeness in one case, for mass murder in the other. Minder didn't think the Franciscans would ever get that bad. He just couldn't equate their earnestness with the cruel brutality he'd been reading about. But the scientist in him couldn't call it impossible. And now he felt as if he was beginning to understand Elgin's actions. Imagine if something that horrendous were ever done in the name of his beloved Francis. Minder sat in his dim rooms, feeling buffeted by emotions bigger than anything he supposed would ever happen to him.